As dawn approached on that fateful 4th day of June 1942, Japanese aviators prepared themselves aboard 4 aircraft carriers scattered across the Pacific. Some sat quietly in their cockpits, inhaling the salt air of early morning. In briefing rooms below deck, others pored over target charts one last time. Meanwhile, maintenance personnel and flight deck teams worked feverishly, making final preparations to aircraft destined to play their part in what was supposed to be a triumphant moment. What none of them knew was that American forces, positioned 240 miles northeast of their location, had already begun preparing their own assault. 3 U.S. carriers were turning to face the wind, readying their squadrons for launch. The coming hours would transform Japan's anticipated crushing victory over American naval aviation into the most devastating loss the empire would suffer. The very carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor with such success would soon rest on the ocean floor, taking with them more than 3,000 trained personnel and Japan's ambitions for Pacific dominance, along with irreplaceable pilots and crew members whose expertise had taken years to cultivate. This moment represented the peak of half a year of Japanese triumphs. What follows is an examination of this decisive engagement as experienced by those who suffered defeat. The Japanese strategists who conceived the operation, the aviators who executed the missions, and the sailors who perished in the flames. 2 months prior to the catastrophe at Midway in the capital city of Tokyo during the spring of 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who commanded the combined fleet, found himself embroiled in contentious debates with the Naval General Staff. Despite public perceptions of continuing success, significant problems plagued Japanese operations. The previous December's assault on Pearl Harbor, though executed brilliantly from a tactical standpoint, had utterly failed to eliminate even one American aircraft carrier, a fact that troubled Yamamoto constantly. The USS Enterprise and USS Lexington had been conducting operations at sea when the attack occurred, and in the 6 months since, these carriers had repeatedly struck Japanese positions throughout the Pacific theater. The situation worsened considerably on April 18th, when American B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier USS Hornet, suddenly appeared above Tokyo itself. The Doolittle raid represented an almost unthinkable disgrace for Japanese military forces who had promised the emperor absolute protection. Though the raid inflicted relatively minor physical destruction, it created profound psychological shockwaves within Japanese command circles. The homeland's vulnerability had been starkly demonstrated, and accountability had to be assigned. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the officer who had commanded the Pearl Harbor operation, found himself particularly disturbed by these developments. Critics had attacked him for failing to authorize a 3rd attack wave at Pearl Harbor, for not locating the American carriers, and now the capital itself had been bombed. The demand for some decisive military action became overwhelming. However, Japanese high command remained characteristically fractured in its strategic thinking. Within the corridors where power resided, 2 conflicting approaches emerged for consideration. The Naval General Staff, displaying their typical conservatism and caution, pushed for a southern strategy that would consolidate existing territorial gains in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, thereby severing the supply routes connecting America with Australia. Yamamoto, however, envisioned something quite different, a plan born from a mixture of perceived opportunity and genuine desperation. Yamamoto understood something that few other Japanese leaders truly grasped. Time worked against them. His years in America, where he had studied at Harvard and served in the role of naval attaché, had provided him with first-hand observation of American industrial capacity. He had witnessed the massive steel production facilities in Pittsburgh, observed the shipbuilding operations at Newport News, and seen the vast agricultural lands capable of feeding millions of industrial workers. Once American war production machinery reached its full operational capacity, Japan would face overwhelming material superiority. In a documented conversation with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye from 1940, Yamamoto had stated clearly that if ordered to fight, he could promise fierce resistance for perhaps 6 months, but beyond that time frame, lasting 2 or 3 years, he possessed no confidence whatsoever in the outcome. This forecast would prove remarkably accurate. In another verified statement from September 1941, he had cautioned that initially Japan would achieve success in all directions, expanding like an octopus extending its tentacles, but this advantage would persist for only a year and a half at maximum. Yamamoto's proposed solution took the form of Operation MI, the invasion of Midway Atoll. These tiny islands, covering merely 6 square miles of coral and sand combined, possess strategic value far exceeding their physical size. Situated 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, Midway functioned as America's most western outpost, providing essential refueling capabilities for submarines and reconnaissance aircraft patrolling the central Pacific region. More critically for Yamamoto's purposes, Midway would function as irresistible bait, forcing American carriers out from Pearl Harbor. When they emerged to defend the atoll, the superior Japanese naval forces would annihilate them in the decisive engagement, the Kantai Kessen that Japanese naval philosophy had always envisioned. The operational plan proved extraordinarily complex, perhaps excessively so. It required multiple forces operating across thousands of miles of ocean simultaneously. An invasion fleet designated to capture Midway, a carrier striking force to eliminate American air capabilities, a main body including battleships with Yamamoto's flagship, the massive Yamato, and even a diversionary assault on the Aleutian Islands meant to confuse American commanders. Approximately 200 vessels in total comprised the largest fleet Japan had ever assembled. The operation order itself extended to 700 pages, distributed mere days before departure, providing subordinate commanders barely sufficient time to familiarize themselves with its contents. Opposition to the plan existed, but proved ultimately ineffective. Rear Admiral Motome Ugaki, serving as Yamamoto's chief of staff, conducted war games during early May that produced troubling outcomes. During these tabletop simulations, American carriers appeared sooner than anticipated and caused serious damage to the Japanese fleet. These results, however, were literally overruled. The umpires arbitrarily minimized American successes and refloated Japanese vessels that the exercises had sunk. When Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical architect who had designed the Pearl Harbor attack, voiced concerns regarding the operation's complexity and carrier vulnerability, his objections were dismissed. The victory disease, that deadly overconfidence bred from 6 months of easy conquests, had infected even the most intelligent minds within the Imperial Navy. Japanese intelligence believed they had sunk 2 American carriers at Coral Sea during May. In reality, they had destroyed only one, the USS Lexington. They assumed the USS Yorktown had sustained damage so severe she would remain inoperative for months. Japanese intelligence failed to detect the desperate repair work at Pearl Harbor, where 1,400 workers labored continuously around the clock to restore Yorktown to operational status in merely 3 days, an accomplishment Japanese shipyards could never have matched. They calculated that Americans could field at most 2 operational carriers to oppose them. Meanwhile, the officer selected to command the carrier strike force, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, harbored profound personal doubts. Nagumo was not a carrier admiral by either training or natural inclination, a torpedo warfare specialist who had received command of the First Air Fleet more through seniority than relevant expertise. He had never felt comfortable with naval aviation operations. At Pearl Harbor, his cautious nature had prevented a third strike that might have destroyed American fuel storage facilities and repair infrastructure. Now, he faced orders to lead an even more complicated operation, with forces growing increasingly worn down. His carriers had operated at sea almost continuously since Pearl Harbor, launching strikes against Darwin and Ceylon while supporting operations from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. His flight crews were exhausted, and the vessels required maintenance urgently. Most troubling, the recent Battle of the Coral Sea in May had proven costly for Japan. While technically a Japanese victory given the Lexington's sinking, strategically it represented a setback. The carrier Shokaku had been severely damaged and would need months for repairs. Her sister vessel had lost so many aircraft and aviators that she couldn't participate in the Midway operation. Two of Japan's finest carriers would be absent from what was supposed to be the decisive battle. As Nagumo confided to his chief of staff, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, they were being asked to accomplish too much with insufficient resources. The Americans had been granted time for preparation. His pilots were exhausted, and the location of American carriers remained unknown. Yamamoto was gambling with the Empire's fate itself. Perhaps the most catastrophic flaw in Japanese planning involved intelligence and fundamental mindset. Unknown to the Japanese, American cryptographers had broken the Japanese Navy's JN-25B code. Commander Joseph Rochefort's station Hypo at Pearl Harbor had been intercepting and decoding Japanese communications since early 1942. The Americans knew about Operation M1 and knew the target was Midway. They even knew the attack date. Admiral Chester Nimitz could position his carriers precisely where they needed to be, in perfect ambush position. The Japanese plan depended heavily on surprise and on American carriers being absent or arriving piecemeal. Neither assumption would prove true. Several intelligence failures compounded Japanese problems. The planned flying boat reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor, designated Operation K, was cancelled when submarines Y-123 found American warships USS Thornton and USS Ballard occupying French frigate shoals, the intended refueling location. This operation had succeeded in March, when two Kawanishi H-8K flying boats had refueled there from submarines to bomb Oahu. But Nimitz had learned from that raid and stationed ships to prevent its repetition. The submarine cordon that was supposed to detect American carriers leaving Pearl Harbor arrived a day late. The American carriers had already passed through. The planned reconnaissance by flying boats of Pearl Harbor, Operation K, was thwarted when the refueling point was occupied. One by one, the eyes that might have provided warning of the American trap were being systematically blinded. Radio intelligence did suggest increased American submarine activity and message traffic around Midway. The ease with which Americans had located Japanese forces at Coral Sea implied their codes might be compromised, but these warnings were brushed aside. As one staff officer characterized the situation, Americans were too intellectually inferior to break Japanese codes and too cowardly to engage unless possessing overwhelming numerical superiority. They would approach Midway only after Japanese forces had secured it, and then they would be destroyed. On May 27th, marking the anniversary of Admiral Togo's great triumph over Russian forces at Tsushima, Nagumo's carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, departed from the inland sea. 4 carriers set sail, Akagi, meaning Red Castle, which had previously served as Yamamoto's command and now functioned as Nagumo's flagship, Kaga, meaning Increased Joy, the converted battleship, Hiryu, meaning Flying Dragon, and Soryu, meaning Green Dragon. Collectively, they carried 248 aircraft, including 21 Zeros being transported to Midway, with 225 operational for combat purposes, and the world's most experienced naval aviators. These were the vessels and men who had devastated Pearl Harbor, who had rampaged from Hawaii to Ceylon. Surely nothing could stop them now. Commander Minoru Genda, still recovering from his emergency appendectomy, but serving as Nagumo's air operations officer despite his condition, made a final diary entry before departure. They sailed with troubled hearts. The operation had been rushed, intelligence was inadequate, and the plan proved too complex. But they were samurai who would perform their duty even if it led to death. May the gods protect Japan, for he feared they sailed toward catastrophe. The fatal overconfidence was perhaps best illustrated by the treatment of Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack. In late May, Fuchida underwent emergency appendectomy surgery aboard Akagi. The procedure left him too weak for flight operations, depriving the Japanese of their most experienced strike commander at the most critical juncture. According to later statements from other officers, Fuchida observed the preparations from his hospital bed with mounting anxiety, sensing that everything about this operation felt fundamentally wrong. The timing, the planning, the very atmosphere seemed heavy with approaching disaster. However, historians caution that Fuchida's post-war testimony must be evaluated carefully, as modern scholarship has questioned many of his assertions. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 3rd, 600 miles northward, the Aleutian Islands operation commenced. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's second carrier strike force, comprising the light carriers Ryujo and Junyo, launched attacks against Dutch Harbor in Alaska. This was intended as the Great Diversion, drawing American forces northward while Nagumo struck Midway. But unknown to Japanese planners, the Americans had not fallen for the deception. Admiral Chester Nimitz, fully informed through his codebreakers regarding the actual target, had maintained his carriers near Midway. The elaborate deception had deceived no one except the Japanese themselves. Meanwhile, Nagumo's carriers steamed through fog banks toward their launch position, observing strict radio silence that would prevent any coordination between the widely separated forces. In the ready rooms, aviators received their final mission briefings. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, designated to lead the first strike, examined reconnaissance photographs of Midway one last time. The images were weeks old, but displayed the airfield, fuel storage facilities, and defensive installations. What they failed to show was the recent reinforcement of the island, the additional fighters and bombers, and most critically, the radar installation that would detect the Japanese strike formation while still 93 miles distant. That evening, American PBY Catalina flying boats spotted portions of the Japanese invasion fleet 700 miles west of Midway. This initial contact electrified American commanders. Navy pilot Ensign Jack Reed, flying a PBY, reported at 0925, sighted main body bearing 262 degrees, distant 700 miles. However, Nagumo's carriers remained undetected, concealed by weather conditions and distance. On Akagi's bridge, tension was palpable. Chief of Staff Kusaka approached Nagumo with concerns. If Americans had spotted the invasion force, they might be more alert than anticipated. Nagumo dismissed the worry. The invasion force was supposed to be observed. It would draw American forces out. Tomorrow they would eliminate enemy air power on Midway, and when American carriers arrived to counterattack, Japanese forces would be prepared and waiting. But even as Nagumo spoke these confident words, 300 miles northeast, Admiral Raymond Spruance, aboard USS Enterprise, was calculating the probable position of the Japanese carrier force. The American carriers were positioned exactly where Japanese calculations said they shouldn't be. Already at sea, already in position, already preparing to launch strikes. Task Force 16 under Spruance's command with Enterprise and Hornet, and Task Force 17 under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's command with the hastily repaired Yorktown, had reached Point Luck, their designated meeting point northeast of Midway, completely undetected by any Japanese reconnaissance. Weather conditions were clear. Seas were calm. Perfect flying weather with visibility extending for miles. At precisely 0430 hours, Akagi and Kaga commenced launching the first wave against Midway. The launch proceeded without incident. 36 Ichidi-3A Val dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate-level bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. Lieutenant Tomonaga led them into the brightening sky, circling once over the fleet before heading southeast toward Midway, 240 miles away. As the 108 aircraft formed up and departed, Nagumo made his first fateful decision of the day. Despite doctrine calling for a full deckload strike to maximize impact, he held back 108 aircraft, Kates armed with Type 91 torpedoes and 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs, in case American ships appeared. It seemed prudent at the time, but would prove catastrophic. Below decks in Akagi's hangar, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida observed the launch from his sickbed, still recovering from his appendectomy. The absence of his experience and tactical brilliance would be keenly felt in the hours ahead. According to accounts from other officers who witnessed events, Fuchida expressed deep concern about the operation, though his specific words remain unverified in contemporary documents. At 0500 hours, Nagumo launched his search planes, just 7 aircraft to cover a vast expanse of ocean. By comparison, Americans had over 30 PBYs searching for the Japanese fleet. Most critically, the search plane from the heavy cruiser Tone, designated Scout No. 4, and assigned to search the sector where American carriers actually were positioned, launched 30 minutes behind schedule. Various sources attribute this to catapult malfunctions, though some suggest engine problems or administrative delays. This single mechanical failure would cascade into disaster. Ironically, recent scholarly research suggests that had the plane launched punctually, its search pattern might have missed the American task forces entirely. At 0534 hours, PBY pilot Lieutenant Howard Adey spotted the Japanese carriers and transmitted the electrifying message, "Enemy carriers." He followed with additional detail at 0552 hours. 2 carriers and battleships bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, course 135 degrees, speed 25 knots. On Enterprise, Spruance made a command decision that would shape the battle's outcome. Despite the extreme range of nearly 200 miles, he ordered an immediate strike. His aircraft would possess barely sufficient fuel to return, but he wanted to catch the Japanese at their most vulnerable moment, recovering their Midway strike aircraft. Meanwhile, at 0553 hours, radar on Midway detected the incoming Japanese strike 93 miles out. Air raid sirens wailed across the small atoll. Every available aircraft scrambled, bombers to attack the Japanese fleet, fighters to defend the island. Marine fighters launched into the air. 20 obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters and 7 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters. They were outnumbered 4-1 by the escorting Zeros. The interception occurred at 0616 hours. Marine Major Floyd Parks, commanding the defenders, made his final radio transmission. Hawks at Angels 14, supported by fighters. The slaughter proved swift and brutal. The Zeros, with their superior maneuverability and experienced pilots, tore through the Marine formation with devastating efficiency. Within minutes, 13 Marine fighters were shot down, 4 severely damaged. Major Parks numbered among the dead. The Zeros lost merely 3 aircraft. At 0630 hours, Tomonaga's strike force arrived over Midway. The dive bombers and level bombers executed their attacks with precision, igniting fuel storage tanks, destroying structures, and cratering the runway. But as Tomonaga circled to evaluate damage, he observed something troubling. American aircraft were still departing from the supposedly neutralized airfield. The runway, though damaged, remained operational. Most significantly, none of the American aircraft had been caught on the ground. They had all been launched before the strike arrived. At 0700 hours, Tomonaga radioed Nagumo. "There is need for a second attack wave." This message reached Nagumo at 0700 hours, precisely as the first American strikes from Midway began arriving. Initially came 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and 4 B-26 Marauder medium bombers carrying torpedoes. The Zeros assigned to combat air patrol swarmed them viciously. 5 Avengers were destroyed, 2 B-26s shot down, but 1 B-26, nicknamed Susie Q and piloted by Lieutenant James Murray, made a desperate run directly at Akagi after releasing his torpedo. According to multiple Japanese eyewitnesses, including bridge personnel, the bomber roared down the entire length of Akagi's flight deck, its gunners firing and killing 2 sailors. The aircraft pulled up at the last possible second, barely clearing the bridge where Nagumo and his staff ducked for cover. Murray's aircraft sustained over 500 bullet holes and lost hydraulic fluid, yet somehow managed to return to Midway. A second B-26, piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays and heavily damaged, actually crashed into the ocean adjacent to Akagi's bridge, possibly attempting a deliberate ramming attack. This near miss produced a profound psychological effect. As Captain Kusaka would later testify, the Admiral was visibly shaken. To have an enemy aircraft nearly crash into the bridge, it was as if the war god had delivered a warning. Additional American attacks followed in rapid succession. 16 Marine dive bombers, led by Major Lofton Henderson, who would perish leading his squadron. 15 B-17 Flying Fortresses bombing from high altitude. 11 Marine SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers. All were repulsed with heavy losses, achieving no hits, but they kept Japanese carriers dodging and maneuvering, unable to conduct efficient flight operations. At 0715 hours, Nagumo confronted a critical decision. His reserve aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes designed for attacking ships. But Tomonaga required support at Midway, and no enemy carriers had been located. After heated discussion with his staff, Nagumo issued the order that would seal his fate: remove torpedoes, load land attack ordnance. This violated Yamamoto's explicit instructions to maintain half the force ready for anti-ship operations. Down in the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, chaos erupted. Ordnance crews commenced the laborious process of removing Type 91 torpedoes and 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with smaller land attack munitions. Contrary to regulations and safety protocols, the removed torpedoes were stacked in the hangar spaces rather than being returned to the magazines deep below. There wasn't sufficient time. Bombs were piled near the aircraft. Fuel hoses snaked everywhere as planes were refueled. As one mechanic, Airman Mori, would later testify if he had survived, the hangar deck resembled a bomb factory. One spark, and everyone would be dead. At 0728 hours, everything changed. The Tone's delayed scout plane, number 4, finally reported sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Nagumo immediately signaled ascertain ship types. The response didn't arrive for 12 agonizing minutes. Meanwhile, the rearming process continued, the hangar decks becoming increasingly cluttered with ordnance. At 0745 hours, another American strike arrived. 16 Marine dive bombers from VMSB 241, led by Major Henderson. The Zeros savaged them, shooting down 8, but the attacks kept coming, forcing violent evasive maneuvers that prevented flight operations. Nagumo found himself trapped in an impossible situation. His fighters were running low on fuel and ammunition from fighting off continuous attacks. Tomonaga's strike force would return soon, also fuel depleted. His decks were covered with aircraft being rearmed, and somewhere out there were American surface ships, possibly carriers. At 0809 hours, Tone Scout number 4 finally clarified enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo breathed somewhat easier, no carriers, and continued rearming for a second Midway strike. But at 0820 hours, another message shattered his temporary relief. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu, immediately signaled Nagumo at 0830 hours, consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Yamaguchi, aggressive and decisive by nature, perceived the danger with clarity. Every minute of delay increased vulnerability. But Nagumo hesitated. His aircraft were in disarray, some armed with bombs, some with torpedoes, many not armed at all. His fighters needed to land and refuel. Tomonaga's returning strike was approaching. To launch now would mean a partial, uncoordinated attack lacking fighter escort, violating every principle of Japanese carrier doctrine. Commander Minoru Genda, despite his illness from the appendectomy, was consulted. According to staff officer testimonies, he argued for immediate launch. Speed is everything now. Launch what we have available. But Captain Kusaka counseled caution. If they attacked piecemeal, they would suffer heavy losses for minimal gain. Better to recover their aircraft, arm them properly, and launch a fully constituted strike according to doctrine. Nagumo, always cautious, always following established procedures, sided with Kusaka. They would recover Tomonaga's force, rearm and refuel properly, then strike with full strength. He signaled all carriers, after completing recovery of aircraft, we shall proceed north to engage the enemy. This decision, logical, prudent, and completely disastrous, sealed the fate of the Kido Butai. As Tomonaga's planes landed, starting at 0837 hours, and were struck below to be refueled and rearmed, the hangar decks became death traps. Fuel lines were everywhere. Bombs and torpedoes were scattered about. The constant cycling of elevators brought planes up and down. Safety protocols were completely abandoned in the rush to prepare for launch. No one noticed the first American torpedo planes appearing on the horizon until too late. At 0920 hours, the first American carrier aircraft arrived. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Without fighter escort, flying obsolete aircraft at merely 100 knots barely above the waves, they pressed their attack against the entire Japanese fleet. The Zeros on combat air patrol, finally encountering worthy targets after hours battling land-based attacks, descended like hawks on helpless prey. The massacre proved total. One by one, the slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers were destroyed. All 15 were annihilated. Of 30 aircrew, only one survived, Ensign George Gay, who would float in the water, concealing himself under his seat cushion, observing the rest of the battle unfold. Not a single torpedo struck its target, but Waldron's sacrifice wasn't meaningless. The Zeros were all drawn down to sea level, concentrated on the torpedo planes. At 0954 hours, 14 Devastators from Enterprise's VT-6 arrived, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. Again, the Zeros swarmed down. 10 were destroyed. 4 escaped. No hits achieved. At 1000 hours, 12 Devastators from Yorktown's VT-3 attacked, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. 10 more shot down. Still no torpedo hits registered. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 survived. It seemed like another pointless slaughter. On Akagi's bridge, relief and even celebration erupted. American attacks had been repulsed with terrible losses. Nagumo ordered the strike force prepared for launch at 10:30 hours. Victory seemed within grasp. But high above, unnoticed with every Zero at sea level, Two groups of SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 33 dive bombers from Enterprise, had searched beyond his calculated interception point, gambling his fuel reserves to locate the Japanese. He had spotted the destroyer Arashi speeding northward. It had been depth-charging the submarine USS Nautilus and followed its course directly to the Kido Butai. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's 17 dive bombers from Yorktown arrived from a different direction at precisely the same moment. At 10:20 hours, lookouts on Akagi screamed, "Hell divers!" But it was too late. With the Zeros at sea level, with the decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft, with bombs and torpedoes scattered throughout the hangar spaces, the Japanese carriers were perfectly vulnerable. At 10:22 hours, McCluskey pushed over into his dive from 14,500 feet altitude. Behind him, his squadrons rolled into their attack dives. The rising sun insignia on the carrier decks below grew larger, becoming perfect targets in the crystalline Pacific morning. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey directed his bombers against Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best took his division against Akagi. Almost simultaneously, Leslie's Yorktown bombers plunged towards Soryu. The Japanese carriers, recovering from violent evasive maneuvers and with their decks crowded with aircraft, were caught at their most vulnerable moment. On Kaga, 4 bombs struck in rapid succession. The first, a 1,000-pound bomb, exploded near the bridge at 10:22 hours, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his command staff instantly. The second struck the flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck, where fueled aircraft exploded in chain reactions. The third and fourth bombs transformed the ship into an inferno. Within minutes, Kaga became a floating torch, with ammunition detonating and aviation fuel creating walls of flame. Akagi took just one direct hit at 10:24 hours from Lieutenant Best's bomb, but it proved sufficient. The 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar among 18 aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The induced explosions of the improperly stored ordnance proved catastrophic. Torpedoes detonated, bombs exploded, and aviation fuel created an unstoppable conflagration. Bridge personnel reported that within 2 minutes, the entire hangar deck had become an inferno with temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Soryu suffered 3 direct hits in her hangar spaces at 10:25 hours. Lieutenant Leslie's bombers placed their ordnance with deadly precision. 13 Vals, 3 Zeros, and 4 Kates on the flight deck were blown apart. Below in the hangars, the stacked torpedoes and bombs created secondary explosions that tore through the ship's vitals. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, refused to abandon his burning vessel. According to testimony from Chief Petty Officer Abe, who was dispatched to rescue him, Yanagimoto was last observed on the bridge, sword in hand, singing the national anthem Kimigayo as flames engulfed the command structure. Only Hiryu, separated from the others by several miles and screened by clouds, escaped. Admiral Yamaguchi immediately prepared a counterstrike, but 3/4 of Japan's carrier striking capability had been eliminated in 5 minutes. At 10:58 hours, even as the 3 carriers burned, Yamaguchi launched 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero escorts led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Following the American plane's return track, they located Yorktown at 1200 hours. Despite fierce resistance from Wildcat fighters and anti-aircraft fire, they scored 3 bomb hits, leaving the American carrier dead in the water, burning and listing. Damage control parties worked frantically, and incredibly, within 2 hours, Yorktown was underway again, making 20 knots. Yamaguchi, aggressive to the end, immediately prepared a second strike. At 13:31 hours, only 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros were available, led by Lieutenant Tomonaga. During the morning Midway strike, Tomonaga's left-wing fuel tank had been damaged. Maintenance crews had only sufficient time to fuel his right tank. Offered an opportunity to switch planes, Tomonaga refused, stating every aircraft was needed. He knew it was a one-way mission. His fuel would only last for the attack run. At 14:30 hours, Tomonaga's small force located Yorktown, now making 19 knots after heroic damage control efforts. American fighters tore into the formation. Tomonaga held his course despite his aircraft catching fire from fighter attacks. According to American witnesses, his burning aircraft maintained its torpedo run until the very last moment, releasing its torpedo before crashing into the sea. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown at 14:45 hours, tearing open her port side and causing a 26-degree list. This time the damage proved fatal. But at 1700 hours, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise located Hiryu. 4 bombs transformed her into another inferno at 1703 hours. Yamaguchi assembled his crew on the tilting flight deck. According to survivors, he apologized for the defeat, urged them to survive and rebuild a stronger navy, then retired to his bridge with Captain Tomeo Kaku. Both chose to go down with their ship. Their bodies were never recovered. Yamaguchi's final message to Nagumo included an apology for the defeat and hope for the Emperor's fortune in war. He was posthumously promoted to Vice Admiral. Through the night of June 4th to 5th, surviving Japanese ships attempted damage control efforts, but it proved hopeless. Soryu sank at 19:13 hours on the 4th, with 711 men lost. Kaga followed at 19:25 hours, taking 811 sailors to the depths. At 02:50 hours on June 5th, Yamamoto, still 600 miles distant aboard his flagship Yamato, with the main body that never engaged, finally accepted reality. He signaled, "Occupation of Midway is cancelled. Withdraw." Akagi proved surprisingly difficult to kill. Despite raging fires, she remained afloat through the night. At 0500 hours on June 5th, after all surviving crew had been evacuated, 4 Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into her hull. She finally sank at 0520 hours. Hiryu, abandoned and burning throughout the night, slipped beneath the waves at 0900 hours on June 5th, with Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku still aboard. As the sun rose on June 5th, the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force rested on the Pacific floor in water over 17,000 feet deep. With them went 3,057 men. Of these casualties, 2,181 perished on the carriers. Akagi lost 267, Kaga 811, Hiryu 392, and Soryu 711. Another 792 died on the heavy cruisers when Mikuma was sunk with 700 dead and Mogami damaged with 92 dead after they collided during night operations and were caught by American aircraft. Crucially, only 110 were aircrew. Most pilots were rescued. The greater, irreplaceable loss was over 700 skilled aircraft mechanics and flight deck personnel, whose expertise had required years to develop. The survivors picked up by destroyers were immediately segregated from the rest of the fleet to prevent news of the disaster from spreading. They were confined below decks, forbidden to communicate with anyone. The disaster wasn't quite finished. On June 6th, Submarine 1168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, found the crippled Yorktown under tow by USS Vireo. Tanabe had been positioned off Midway, providing weather reports, and had observed the morning attacks through his periscope. Now, slipping through the destroyer screen at 3 knots, he achieved what the entire Kido Butai could not. At 13:31 hours, Tanabe fired a spread of 4 torpedoes from 1,200 yards range. 2 struck Yorktown. One hit the destroyer Hammond alongside, providing auxiliary power. Hammond broke in two and sank in 4 minutes with 80 dead, many killed by her own depth charges exploding. Yorktown, struck by 2 more torpedoes, was doomed, but refused to sink immediately. She finally rolled over and sank at 07:01 hours on June 7th in approximately 16,650 feet of water. This small consolation, sinking the carrier that had helped destroy the Kido Butai, barely registered against the scale of Japanese defeat. Meanwhile, heavy cruisers, Mogami and Mikuma, attempting to bombard Midway on the night of June 4th, had collided while avoiding submarine attack. American aircraft located them on June 6th. Mikuma was sunk with 700 hands lost, the highest death toll of any Japanese vessel at Midway. Mogami, heavily damaged with 92 dead, barely managed to reach Truk. The disaster was complete. The journey home proved one of shame and silence. Wounded sailors from the carriers were kept isolated in special compartments. No one was permitted to speak of what had occurred. When the fleet returned to Japan at Hashirajima Naval Base on June 14th, they anchored at night to avoid observation. The wounded were offloaded in darkness, classified as secret patients, and transported to isolated naval hospitals where they were kept under virtual arrest, quarantined even from their own families. They were forbidden any contact with the outside world. According to U.S. Naval Institute sources, they were treated in an appalling manner as disgraced losers. The survivors of the air groups were immediately reassigned to distant bases in the South Pacific without being allowed to see families or friends. The majority would die in subsequent battles during the Solomon Islands campaign. The carrier crews were dispersed to different ships and bases, sworn to secrecy under threat of severe punishment. The systematic cover-up commenced immediately. The government prepared its propaganda. The sunken carriers Akagi and Hiryu remained on the official roster as operational to maintain the fiction they still existed. No flag officers were court-martialed or even officially reprimanded, as this would require admitting defeat. Information about the defeat was withheld from the Imperial Japanese Army for a full month. Even Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was kept in the dark about the full extent of the disaster. On June 5th, while ships still burned, Tokyo Radio announced to the Japanese people that naval and air forces of the Empire had succeeded in inflicting heavy damage on American fleet and air forces in the Central Pacific. Later broadcasts added that Japan had achieved another smashing victory, with 2 American carriers sunk. As an aside, loss of 1 carrier, Kaga, was acknowledged, with Soryu's loss admitted later. Akagi and Hiryu's destruction would not be publicly acknowledged until after the war ended. The Japanese people celebrated in the streets, unaware they were cheering a catastrophe. It wasn't until June 10th that Tokyo press first hinted at problems, using vague language about difficulties in the operation, but still maintaining the fiction of overall victory. Commander Fuchida, recuperating in hospital from his appendectomy and burns received during Akagi's destruction, was visited by a naval intelligence officer who warned him he was forbidden to speak of what happened. As far as the world knew, they had won a great victory. According to post-war accounts that must be treated cautiously given questions about Fuchida's reliability, he responded with bitter irony about the futility of building a war on lies, though this exchange cannot be independently verified. Admiral Yamamoto returned to his cabin aboard Yamato and didn't emerge for 3 days. His staff heard him pacing at night, tortured by his failure. To his diary, he confided thoughts that would only be discovered after the war. According to staff officers who served with him, Yamamoto fell into deep depression, knowing the war was now unwinnable. His prediction to Prime Minister Konoye had proven prophetic. Japan had indeed run wild for 6 months, exactly as he had foreseen. Now at Midway, occurring precisely 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide had turned. In a private meeting with his staff, documented by Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto was brutally frank. "I gambled and lost. In trying to disperse and destroy the American carriers, I have lost our own." To his close friend, Rear Admiral Takechi Hori, he would later write a letter that survived the war. The defeat at Midway was not a matter of bad luck or enemy superiority in numbers. It was the result of our own overconfidence and poor planning. We underestimated American capabilities and overestimated our own. Now we will pay the price for our hubris. I give Japan perhaps 18 months before the situation becomes completely hopeless. His prediction would prove optimistic. Within 18 months, Japan would lose the Marianas, and American B-29s would be within range of the home islands. The true cost of Midway extends far beyond the 4 carriers and 3,057 dead. Japan lost over 100 of its best pilots, men with years of training and combat experience from China to the Indian Ocean. The pilot training program, which requires 2 years minimum to produce a combat-ready aviator and far longer to create an expert, cannot replace them. More critically, the 700-plus skilled aircraft mechanics, armorers, and flight deck crew who died represent institutional knowledge that took decades to develop. These men knew every rivet of their aircraft, every quirk of their carriers' operations. As Admiral Ugaki writes in his diary, later captured and translated, "We can build new carriers in 2 years. We cannot build new pilots with the experience of those we lost. And we will never replace the skilled maintenance crews who knew how to keep our aircraft flying under combat conditions." The real tragedy of Midway is not the ships, but the men. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea 2 years later, in June 1944, inexperienced Japanese pilots would be massacred in what Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviators flying against veteran American pilots in superior aircraft lost over 600 planes while inflicting minimal damage. The seeds of that disaster were planted in the waters off Midway. Midway marked the end of Japanese expansion. Within Imperial General Headquarters, reality slowly sank in despite the propaganda. The planned invasions of Fiji, Samoa, and Hawaii were quietly cancelled. The proposed Operation FS to cut supply lines between America and Australia was abandoned. Instead, Japan was forced into a defensive war it could never win. The Americans, their confidence soaring, began planning their counter-offensive. Guadalcanal, just 2 months away, would begin the long, bloody American advance toward Japan. The psychological impact proved equally devastating. The Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated since the victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905, shattered forever. As one destroyer captain, Commander Tamichi Hara, recalled in his memoirs, "After Midway, we never felt confident again. We went into battle expecting to lose. The Americans went in expecting to win. The whole psychology of the war had changed in those 5 minutes when our carriers were hit. Within the Navy itself, bitter recriminations began immediately, though never publicly. Admiral Nagumo became scapegoat for the defeat, despite following orthodox doctrine and conservative tactics that were standard in Japanese military culture. The inflexibility of thinking, the inability to adapt to unexpected situations, the blind adherence to doctrine even when circumstances changed. All these cultural traits that contributed to the defeat were recognized but could not be changed. The same rigid hierarchy and thinking that led to disaster at Midway would be repeated again and again throughout the war. Post-war analysis revealed the cascade of failures that led to disaster. The Japanese operation proved too complex, with forces scattered across thousands of miles, unable to support each other. Radio silence, maintained religiously, prevented any coordination when plans went awry. Intelligence was abysmal. The Japanese had no idea American carriers were already at sea, while Americans knew every detail of Japanese plans thanks to their code breaking. The failure of reconnaissance proved particularly damning. Only 7 search planes to cover a vast ocean area compared to over 30 American PBY Catalinas. The cancelled Operation K reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor due to American presence at French frigate shoals. The submarine cordon arriving too late to detect American carriers leaving Pearl Harbor. Tone's crucial half-hour delay in launching its scout plane. Each failure individually might not have been fatal. Together, they guaranteed disaster. Perhaps most critically, the Japanese underestimated American capabilities while overestimating their own. They assumed Americans couldn't break their codes. They had. They assumed Yorktown couldn't be repaired quickly. She was fixed in 72 hours. They assumed American pilots were inferior. At Midway, American dive bomber pilots proved devastatingly effective. They assumed American carriers would arrive after Midway was captured. They were waiting in ambush. The damage control failures were equally telling. Japanese carriers with enclosed hangar decks and inadequate firefighting systems became death traps when hit. American carriers with open hangar decks and superior damage control proved far more survivable. Yorktown absorbed tremendous punishment and might have survived except for the submarine attack. The Japanese carriers burned catastrophically from single hits due to poor fuel system design and inadequate ammunition handling procedures. Admiral Yamamoto did not long survive the defeat he knew doomed Japan. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted his travel schedule. P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his plane over Bougainville and shot it down. His death, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid that had precipitated Midway, seemed almost poetic justice. Found in the jungle, still strapped to his seat, sword at his side, Yamamoto took to his grave the full knowledge of how Japan lost the war in those 5 minutes at Midway. Before his death, in one of his last letters to a friend that survived the war, Yamamoto reflected with remarkable clarity, "At Midway, we learned that wars are not won by spiritual strength alone. They are won by intelligence, both kinds, good information, and the wisdom to use it properly. We had neither. We were too proud to believe the Americans could be waiting for us, too rigid to adapt when our plans went wrong, and too arrogant to admit our codes might be broken. Pride goes before a fall, and our pride was limitless. The result was inevitable." The greatest irony of Midway is that it achieved Yamamoto's goal just in reverse. It was indeed the decisive battle he had sought, but it was Japan, not America, that was decisively defeated. The carriers he had tried to trap had instead trapped him. The ambush he had planned became the ambush he suffered. The decisive battle doctrine that Japanese naval strategy had been built upon for 40 years was proven correct, but it was the Americans who won it. As documented in Japanese military archives, Yamamoto had genuinely feared American industrial might. In early 1942, he told his staff, "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame, simply, for the one smitten. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack." At Midway, that counterattack arrived with devastating efficiency. The Americans had not only recovered from Pearl Harbor, but had turned Japanese strategy against them. The war would continue for 3 more years, but its outcome was effectively decided in those 5 minutes on June 4, 1942. Yet beyond the strategic implications, Midway was fundamentally a human tragedy. In waters 325 miles northwest of Midway, 3,057 Japanese sailors and airmen perished. Young men who had written final letters to their families that morning, who had shared rice and tea for breakfast, who had dreams of victory and home. They died in flames that reached 1,000 degrees, drowned in oil-slicked waters, or were torn apart by explosions that could be heard miles away. Lieutenant Hashimoto, one of the few survivors from Akagi's engine room, testified at post-war investigations. "The screams of burning men echo in my nightmares still. We couldn't save them. The passages were blocked by fire, the ladders melted from heat. We could only listen as they died, their voices calling for their mothers, for water, for death to end their agony. Every night I hear them still. The families back home never learned the truth during the war. They received notices that their sons died gloriously for the Emperor in a great victory. Mothers hung gold stars in their windows, proud of their sacrifice, never knowing it was for a defeat that sealed Japan's fate. The truth would only emerge after the war, adding betrayal to grief. Many families refused to believe it even then, so complete had been the deception." Petty Officer Tanaka, who survived Soryu's sinking, recalled the morning before battle. "We were so confident. We joked about which American ship we would sink. Yamada said he would sink a battleship. Suzuki claimed he would shoot down 5 American planes. They were both 18 years old. Both died when the bombs hit. Their bodies were never recovered. Sometimes I wonder if they're still down there, standing at their posts, waiting for orders that will never come." Today, the 4 Japanese carriers rest in over 17,000 feet of water. Their exact locations only recently discovered by deep-sea explorer Robert Ballard and subsequent expeditions. They are war graves, monuments to the price of hubris and the cost of war. The aircraft that once launched from their decks to spread destruction across the Pacific lie crumpled in their hangar bays. The bones of their crews remain at their battle stations, eternal guardians of ships that will never sail again. From the Japanese perspective, Midway represents the moment when dreams of empire collided catastrophically with reality. It proved that spiritual strength alone cannot overcome material weakness, that courage without intelligence leads to disaster, that rigid thinking cannot adapt to fluid situations. It was Japan's appointment with destiny, and destiny proved merciless. The Midway defeat shattered more than ships and lives. It shattered illusions. The myth of Japanese invincibility, the faith in spiritual superiority over material strength, the belief that determination could overcome any odds, all died with the carriers. In their place came grim recognition that Japan had started a war it could not win, against an enemy it had fatally underestimated, using strategies that modern warfare had rendered obsolete. Yet from the ashes of defeat came a different Japan, one that renounced war, embraced democracy, and became a force for peace and prosperity. The samurai spirit that once drove conquest now drives innovation. The nation that once sought to dominate the Pacific now helps maintain its peace. The technological expertise that once built carriers now builds cars and computers. In that transformation, perhaps the 3,057 who died at Midway did not die entirely in vain. The battle also stands as a warning to all nations about the dangers of overconfidence and rigid thinking. The Japanese military, despite its tactical brilliance and brave personnel, fell victim to its own success. Victory disease, the assumption that what worked before will always work, that the enemy will act as expected, that superior spirit will overcome material disadvantage, infected decision-making at every level. The same Navy that had brilliantly executed the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier now bungled basic reconnaissance, ignored intelligence warnings, and walked into a trap that should have been obvious. As we examine Midway from the Japanese perspective, we see not villains but human beings caught in the terrible machinery of war. Young pilots who flew to their deaths with courage, if not wisdom. Commanders making decisions with incomplete information under impossible pressure. Mechanics working frantically to prepare aircraft they would never see again. Sailors fighting fires that could not be controlled, staying at their posts until the end. Their story deserves telling not to glorify defeat or war, but to remember the cost of military aggression and the price of imperial ambition. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, despite questions about his post-war reliability, perhaps captured something essential when he became a Christian evangelist after the war and spent his remaining years preaching reconciliation. Though his specific accounts must be treated cautiously, his transformation from architect of Pearl Harbor to advocate for peace represents the journey Japan itself took, from aggression to pacifism, from empire to democracy, from isolation to international cooperation. The lesson of Midway from the Japanese perspective is ultimately that no nation, no matter how powerful, can afford to underestimate its enemies, overestimate its capabilities, or ignore the changing realities of warfare. The same carriers that had seemed invincible at Pearl Harbor proved fatally vulnerable at Midway. The same pilots who had swept all before them met their match in American dive bombers. The same strategies that had worked against divided enemies failed against a united and informed opponent. In the end, the waters that closed over the Japanese carriers at Midway were the same waters that would eventually wash away the militarism that sent them there. The young men who died believed they were fighting for their emperor and empire. They could not know they were actually dying for the birth of a new Japan, peaceful, prosperous, and democratic. Their sacrifice, though tactically meaningless and strategically disastrous, helped demonstrate the futility of military aggression and the impossibility of sustaining empire through force. This is the Battle of Midway from the Japanese perspective, a story of pride before the fall, of human error compounding into catastrophe, of young lives sacrificed for strategic miscalculation. It deserves telling not to celebrate defeat or victory, but to remember the cost of war and the price of empire. For in the end, the waves that closed over the Japanese carriers at Midway were the same waves that would eventually wash clean the stains of militarism, leaving behind a nation transformed and a lesson for all humanity, that the path of aggression leads only to destruction, and that true strength lies not in conquest but in peace. The ghosts of Midway, Japanese and American alike, remind us that war is not glorious but terrible, not triumphant but tragic, and that peace, however difficult to maintain, is always preferable to even the most decisive victory. In the vast Pacific, where the carriers still lie in their deep graves, the only sound is the eternal movement of the waves, carrying neither Japanese nor American voices, but simply the echo of humanity's costliest lesson, that war, no matter who wins, leaves only loss in its wake.